I'm really glad to get to be here with you. Like Travis said, my wife and I, we just had our annual baby, and we love what we're getting to do as a family. But I love getting to do this. Today I want to do a sermon in two parts. Part one is a brief history of racism in the Bible. So the Bible starts off in the beginning with God creating Adam and Eve, and it doesn't even tell us if Adam and Eve are white or black. It doesn't even tell us if they're Jewish, right? When we first see Adam meeting Eve, Adam says, she's bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh, which is a Hebrew metaphor for saying, where I am weak, she is strong, and vice versa. When we first meet them meeting each other, they're talking about how much they have in common. And as soon as sin enters the world, when we're introduced to the next people, Cain and Abel, we're told that Cain Abel takes care of the flocks and Cain tends the soil. When we first meet someone after sin has entered the world, we are introduced to them by their differences. Did you know that in the Bible, it doesn't divide up the world into races or specific groups of people until Genesis 10? Genesis 9, Noah, God comes and sends a flood, and then Noah curses Ham, his son. And we honestly don't know why Noah curses Ham. Maybe it's just a kosher thing or whatever. That's a joke. It'll catch up with you in a second. But here's what's interesting. Slave owners in the Deep South read those two stories that I've told you in a way that it was unprecedented in Christian history. They read that when Cain killed his brother and God put a mark on him, they read that mark was blackness. Some slave owners read that the curse of Ham that Noah put on his son was actually blackness. No other Christians in human history had thought to read that like that until then. But they did. You may be surprised to know that globally Christianity came out really early against slavery. Catholicism came out almost immediately against slavery. There was a small group of people who read the Bible a certain way, and they had a very invested interest in reading the Bible the certain way. But racism doesn't come from the Bible. It's in the Bible, but it doesn't come from the Bible. It comes from our hearts, which the Bible is, of course, very honest about. And it's so complex the way racism is in the Bible. Like, for example, in the book of Exodus, God delivers a race of oppressed people, the Israelites people who had been in slavery for generations, and as soon as he delivers them, Moses has married a woman who is not his race. She's a Cushite. And his sister Miriam is talking trash about him marrying a woman who's not his race. And God gives her leprosy. God, I kid you not, makes her white. That is white disprivilege, if you ask me. God gives her, commentators call this the curse of whiteness, and he does it because she was talking crud about Moses' wife. And he says, okay, God is basically saying, you want to see what it's like to live outside the community? Here, try living it like that for a week. But the reason this is so interesting is because this was a group of people who had just been systematically oppressed, and they were delivered from slavery. And as soon as they're delivered, we find out that the evil's not just there in the Egyptians and Pharaoh. It's in us too. It gets worse. In the book of Judges is one of the darkest books in the Bible. A lot of people lose their faith reading the book of Judges, so you need to know it was written descriptively, not prescriptively. It's not saying this is how things should be. It was saying this is how things are when everybody's watching out for themselves. And in Judges, we find out it's not just racism. It's tribalism, because there are 12 tribes of Israel, and they all look alike, but they live in different parts of the country, and so they develop different accents. And one tribe, the tribe of Gilead, hates the Ephraimites, and they decide that they're going to kill all the Ephraimites. The problem is they all look like each other. So they're trying to figure out, well, how are we going to figure out who to hate? And then they remember they have this accent, and there's a certain word that they can't say. So after they, wreck shop and kill thousands and thousands of Ephraimites, here's what happens in Judges chapter 12, in order so they can figure out how to kill them. And it starts at verse 5. It says, the Gileadites captured the fords of the Jordan, and whenever a survivor of Ephraim said, let me cross over, the men of Gilead said, are you an Ephraimite? Of course, they're not going to say that. So they said, no. They said, okay, say Shibboleth. If they said Sibboleth, because he could not pronounce the word correctly, they seized him and killed him at the fords of the Jordan. 42,000 Ephraimites died at that time. It gets worse. You know that book of Jonah, the one that you grew up with, a papier-mâché well at VBS? It is not about a well. You know that story is about racism? That's what it's about. Because God comes to Jonah and he tells him, I want you to go preach about me to the Ninevites. The Ninevites, the Assyrians, were the people that Jonah hated. All Israelites hated them, and for good reason. They had done horrible things in the back. And Jonah goes, or Jonah doesn't want to go. And the reason he doesn't want to go is not because he's worried that they won't believe him and they'll take him and kill him. The reason Jonah doesn't want to go is because he's worried they will believe him. And he knows he can't trust the love of God to hate the same people he does. So Jonah doesn't want to go. And Jonah ultimately runs away. God redirects him through a well. He gets there, he preaches, and sure enough, his worst dreams come true. They repent, and it ends with him so mad. He's just sulking in the corner of Nineveh. And God, the last words of Jonah are God asking, shouldn't I have mercy on these people too? I love the way Anne Lamont says it. She says, you can safely assume you've made God in your own image when it turns out God hates all the same people you do. But Jonah hasn't made God in his own image, and that's his problem. You know, side note, whenever people talk about God being a human construct, that we just made this God up, here's a question to ask. What kind of people make up a God like this? What kind of people create a God that says, if you want to love me, then the way you can tell if you're loving me well is if you love the people that you least like? But Jonah hasn't made God in his image. That's his problem. Does it surprise anybody else that Jesus mentions this in his very first sermon? In his very first sermon in Luke chapter 4, when he stands up in his home synagogue, everybody at first thinks, wow, the carpenter kid's got game. And then his point 3 is this. In verse 29 of chapter 4, he says, truly I tell you, no prophet is accepted in his hometown. I assure you, there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time when the sky was shut for 3.5 years and there was a severe famine. Yet Elijah wasn't sent to any of the Israelite widows, but to a widow in Zarephath in the region of Sidon. And there were many in Israel with leprosy. But God healed Naaman the Syrian. And at this, the people try to push him off a cliff. Earlier in the chapter, Satan tries to get Jesus to jump off a cliff, and now we find the people of God, later on in the chapter, are doing the work of Satan. When I first preached my first sermon, they fed me Burger King and patted me on the back. When Jesus preached his first sermon, they try to throw him off the cliff. Does this surprise anybody else that the story of the Good Samaritan is actually about this? We've made it about a lot of other things, but it's about this. Jesus is asked by somebody who's trying to avoid loving everybody, oh, who is my neighbor? And Jesus tells them a story. And in the story, there's all these people who are heroes in the Jewish faith, the Levites, the priests, and they just walk right by. But a Samaritan was somebody that was absolutely despised. They were seen as subhuman. And the guy who's beat up on the side of the road, he's naked, so he doesn't have any identifying markers. He's unconscious. You can't hear his accent or what language you speak. Basically, Jesus is saying this guy's just human. And the question is flipped. He says, if you're ever in that situation, near death, who would you be okay with saving your life? That person is your neighbor. And the hatred runs so deep that when Jesus asked the guy, so who is your neighbor? The guy couldn't even bring himself to say the Samaritan. He said the one who had mercy. That might sound like a bit of an oversell, but listen to this. In John chapter 8, the religious leaders, they approach Jesus and they actually say, aren't we right? You got to check this out. In John chapter 8, in verse 48 and 49, check it out because you're not going to believe me after I tell you this. In John chapter 8, religious leaders come to Jesus and they say, hey, aren't we right in saying that you're demon-possessed and a Samaritan? Like they're so casual about bringing it up. Like, isn't your Uncle Carl? And Jesus responds by saying, I'm not demon-possessed. He won't cooperate with the racism. Jesus is a ninja here. He won't. They ask, aren't we right in saying you're demon-possessed and a Samaritan? And he goes, I'm not demon-possessed. He won't cooperate with their idea that somehow being a Samaritan was a lesser person. Did you know that when Jesus turns over the tables in the temple, this is what it's about? It's not about every church having a coffee shop. It's actually about this, because they set it up in the house, the one place in the temple where Gentiles could come, which is why when Jesus turns over the table, he says, it is written that my Father's house is supposed to be a house of prayer for what? Come on, say it. All nations. But it wasn't. Jesus knew God's dream was for Abraham to be a blessing to the whole world, but it wasn't until part 2 of the sermon. The Apostle Paul. It takes one to know one. Because after Jesus had died and was raised from the dead, there was this apostle, this guy, Paul, who was going around killing Christians. And he was doing it not to be a jerk. He was doing it because he was trying to honor God. And then all of a sudden, Paul has a vision from Jesus, and he learns that Jesus is alive. And all of a sudden, he realizes he had been killing the people of God, not to be a jerk, but to honor God. And all of a sudden, it dawns on him, he was Cain. He had killed his brothers. All of a sudden, it dawns on him, he was standing naked and condemned in front of God because he had treated the people of God in such a bad way. And so Paul spends the rest of his life being the reverse Jonah. He's the shibboleth gatekeeper. He makes sure the gate stays open. He goes all over the world planting the churches for the widows of Isaiah, to the wives of Moses. He plants what he would call temples for them to belong to. He tells everybody in the Gentile world about King Jesus. And listen, if you're here today and you're not a Jew, the reason you're here is because the Apostle Paul, he worked and bled and sweat and hiked miles to get out this idea that we today are bored with. You want to know what it is? That all people are created equal. You did not get that from your Declaration of Independence. That's a lie. It is anything but self-evident. Try describing to me, without reaching for some idea about God or Jesus, why someone an older person in a wheelchair is as equal as a strong, strapping young man. No, you have very Christian ideas that Jesus gave you, that Paul gave you by planting these churches outside the Jewish world. Did you know that back in the ancient world, pity was seen as a weakness, not a virtue? Mercy was not a virtue. That helping out the weak in your society was a good way to make your society a weaker. A lot of us see Paul as this oppressive, homophobic, sexist, pro-slavery, anti-freedom guy who talks about sex too much because he's single and he doesn't have to get any. He doesn't get to have any. But listen, every category I just mentioned was actually one that Paul gave you and spent his life fighting against. So I grew up in Benton, Arkansas, and I was in a very segregated city. And along with segregation comes fear. Just didn't spend a lot of time with people who were different than me. And so, church I grew up in, one time I was driving a guy back home after church, and I cut through this place called The Hill. And The Hill is where they lived. That was where the black people in Benton, Arkansas lived. And it was notorious among little white kids, because we just didn't go there. And I cut through there, and my car broke down. I was driving my parents' minivan, because that's real cool to pick up women in. And it was pre-cell phone, so I didn't have any way of calling anybody. I was a long way from walking distance. And all of a sudden, Sunday afternoon, a car pulls up that's got 4 heavy-set black women in it. And they pull over, and they're like, "Can we help you? What's going on?" I tell them my parents' vans broke down. They're like, "Come on with us. You can use our home phone." So I get in the car with them. I'm in the back seat with them, in the middle of the back seat. And that Sesame Street song is playing in my head. One of these things is not like the other, And as we're driving along, I see what was the largest man I had ever seen in my life at that point, coming up on the horizon. And they say, "Look, there's Tyrell." And I noticed that we were getting closer to Tyrell. I would like to put distance between me and Tyrell. And they roll the window down, and they say to him, "Tyrell, we got us a new man now." And Tyrell looks in at me, and I was like, "No. You're the man, Tyrell. You're the man." And Tyrell reaches in the window, grabs my hand, shakes it, and says, "Well, then welcome to the family." And it was a holy moment for me. One where I realized that those broad, sweeping generalizations I had been using just didn't work anymore. Listen, whenever racism becomes a topic in our country, in our culture, I cringe because I know what we're going to do. We're all going to run to our talking points. We're going to start saying, "I have a friend who," and we're going to ignore the very Christian resources we have that could actually be a part of the healing of the nations. Confession, naming it, being honest. So let me go first. I'm a racist. I grew up in Benton, Arkansas, where everybody was segregated. I'm a racist. I grew up with the flag that everybody's talking about hanging on my wall. I grew up with it on a t-shirt that said, "You wear your ex, and I'll wear mine," which is not a shirt designed to make friends. And I wouldn't take that shirt off. I didn't take that shirt off. I didn't change my shirt when I had a gun pointed at my face for wearing it. I did, however, have to change my pants later that day, but I didn't take it off then. What made me take it off was water. Because a couple of weeks after I became a Christian, I got baptized, everything changed for me. I remember I was driving along with some of my friends, and a black family had just moved into the community, in the rural farming community that I grew up with. And a few of my friends, we were driving past that family's house, and they wanted me to yell the N-word. And I'd been had this conviction stirring in me for a while. I knew I couldn't do it. And it's not my most noble Christian moment in my life, because I wound up getting in a fist fight later, and I lost my friendship over it. And I lost the fight as well. But I knew then that day, as I left, had to walk 4 miles to get to where I was going because they didn't give me a ride. I knew that day as I was walking, I was a Christian. I was a Christian more than I was an Arkansan, more than I was a farm boy, more than I was a white person, more than I was an American. I was a Christian. I like the way the Baptist pastor Russell Moore says this. He says, the cross and the Confederate flag can only exist for so long before one of them sets the other on fire. I'm glad the cross won that battle in my life. I think that conversion, or some version of it, is what it means to be a part of every Christian. It is to realize you belong to a new humanity. We don't define each other by our skin color, our voting preferences any longer. You are a part of a new race of people. If you're a Christian, this is the story God is trying to tell. We are in Christ, and that's enough. Do you realize this is the main reason Paul writes so many of his letters? Like in 2 Corinthians 5, we read earlier, the ministry of reconciliation. Or Galatians 3, when you've been baptized, there's neither slave nor free, Jew nor Gentile, male nor female. Do you realize Paul opens every one of his letters with grace and peace? Grace was the Greek greeting. Peace was the Jewish greeting. He's trying to get these two people together. The thing that we're talking about constantly these days was a Christian sin. Outside of Christianity, I don't know a reason why racism is wrong. For thousands of years, nobody thought it was wrong that you would love people that looked like you, thought like you, acted like you, came from the same tribe. Jesus is creating a new humanity, and the church has the resources to be able to confess it, to confess our biases, and to reach out and love and know each other, not just as pandering, not as political correctness, but as family. This is Jesus' dream. So last year, I went on a tour with 10 black pastors and 10 white pastors all over the civil rights movement, which all happened to be churches. And at one point, we stopped at the 16th Avenue Baptist Church where a KKK bomb had killed 4 little black girls. And it's heartbreaking. Who bombs a church? And then I was sitting there, I realized, they had the right target, right? Because if you want to stop this vision, you don't bomb the Department of Justice. It didn't come from the Department of Justice. It came from the church. Go back and watch those civil rights videos. The best part of Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech? It's what people are wearing. They're wearing their dresses and their suits and their Sunday best. You know why? It's because they just came from church. This whole thing came from church. It didn't start in Washington. It may end up there, but it didn't start there. This dream started in a manger, and it went all over the world with an apostle planting churches and writing letters about what it meant to live out the way of Jesus around a table. This is the life of the world. This is the healing of the nations. Do you know what church is? The church is the dream of Jesus. The church is the life of saints and the hope of sinners. It is a city set on a hill. It is a counterculture for the good of culture. It is the hope of the world. This is what Jesus is inviting us into. Did you know that the word kindness, which is a big deal no matter what you believe, you know that word actually comes from kin? Because you're supposed to be kind to people who are related to you. Jesus is trying to create a different kind of family. A kind of family where we have a different kind of kind. We're kind to people that we're not related to because by Jesus we are family together. This is God's dream. It's the church of Jesus. It is the church that Paul planted. It is the church that we are called to be. A church of difference that can make a difference. A diverse city within every city. It is a church of a different kind. The healing of the nations. And so may we, brothers and sisters in Christ, may we live out the gospel. May we no longer regard one another the way we used to. May we live out the way of Jesus and be a part of the healing of the nations. Go in peace.